A sharp knock at the door startled Sarah Thompson from her reading. She wasn't expecting visitors this late, and the wind outside howled against the window panes. The knock came again. No, not a knock. Scratching. Sarah set her book down and rose cautiously, peering through the peephole. At first, all she saw was darkness. Then, shifting movement below. She unlocked the door and cracked it open. A dog sat there, its ribs stark beneath a ragged coat of black and gray fur. Its eyes, golden like firelight, stared up at her, unblinking, intelligent. Then she saw the object at its feet. A bundle, wrapped haphazardly in stained cloth, damp from the mist rolling in from the trees. The dog nudged it forward with its nose and whimpered softly. Sarah hesitated, glancing around the porch. No signs of an owner, no leash. Just the dog and its peculiar offering. The creature's stare unsettled her. It wasn't just hungry or lost. It had come with intent. She knelt, hesitating only a moment before reaching for the bundle. The cloth was stiff, the smell of damp earth and rust clinging to it. Carefully, she peeled back the fabric, and her breath caught in her throat. An old, rusted locket lay tangled in the folds, the chain broken. Nestled beside it, small and brittle, a bone, too small for an animal. The realization sent a ripple of unease through her. She glanced back at the dog. It stared at her expectantly. Sarah's pulse quickened. She picked up the locket, wiping away years of grime. A photograph peeked through the cracked glass inside. A girl, no older than 10, smiling as she hugged a much younger version of this very dog. The dog watched her reaction closely, as though gauging whether she understood. Sarah swallowed, standing. The night suddenly felt colder, the wind pressing against her like unseen hands. She stepped back inside, motioning to the dog. "Come in." The dog hesitated only a second before following, his paws clicking against the hardwood. She closed the door, locking it. Inside, under the warm kitchen light, she studied the locket again. The girl in the picture had bright eyes, her hair in twin braids. There was something familiar about her, but Sarah couldn't place why. She turned the locket over. A faint engraving on the back, barely legible, L.R. Her mind raced. A name? A message? She glanced at the dog, who had settled by the doorway, watching her. The weight of its stare made her uneasy. "This belonged to someone, didn't it?" she murmured. The dog gave a small, sharp bark. She set the locket down and picked up the bone, turning it over in her fingers. The brittle texture, the size, her gut told her this wasn't just a random discovery. "You brought this to me for a reason." The dog thumped its tail once against the floor. Sarah exhaled and reached for her phone. If there was any record of a missing person tied to the initials L.R., she needed to know. As she typed, the dog suddenly stiffened, its ears pricking toward the front door. A low, guttural growl rumbled from its throat. Sarah froze. A shadow moved past the window. She turned off the kitchen light in one swift motion, plunging the room into darkness. Carefully, she stepped closer to the window, heart pounding. Outside, across the street, a figure stood just beyond the glow of the street lamp. Still, watching. The dog growled again, deeper this time. Sarah's breath came shallow. The figure didn't move, didn't step forward. Then, without warning, it turned and disappeared into the night. She stayed there for a long moment, listening to the wind, the rhythmic ticking of the clock on the wall. The dog remained tense, muscles coiled. Sarah exhaled slowly and turned back to the table. The locket gleamed under the dim glow of her phone screen. Whatever she had just been dragged into, she was certain of one thing. This wasn't over. Sarah barely slept. Every time she closed her eyes, the image of the locket burned behind her eyelids. The girl's smile. The dog, younger but unmistakable. The initials on the back. And the shadowy figure outside, watching. By morning, she was certain of two things. The dog, whoever he belonged to, had brought her something important. And someone didn't want her to have it. She sat at her kitchen table, sipping coffee, scrolling through Old Town records on her laptop. The dog, whom she had started calling Shadow, lay curled near her feet, his ears twitching at every distant noise. Silver Creek, That was the partial name she had found on Shadow's torn collar tag the night before. It wasn't much to go on, but it was something. A quick search pulled up several results, mostly hiking trails, a few old cabins. But one article caught her attention. A missing person case. Lily Reynolds. 10 years ago, vanished without a trace near Silver Creek. Sarah's pulse quickened as she clicked on a link. A faded photo appeared, a girl with dark braids, bright eyes. The same girl from the locket. LR. Her stomach twisted. Lily had been reported missing after wandering into the woods behind her family's cabin. The search went on for weeks, but nothing was ever found. No body. No evidence. Eventually, the case was closed, presumed drowning. But if she had drowned, where was her body? And how had her locket ended up wrapped in cloth, delivered by a dog 10 years later? Sarah glanced down at Shadow. He was watching her, unblinking, as if waiting for her to figure out. She grabbed her phone and dialed a number she hadn't called in years. Greg Lawson answered on the second ring. Sarah? It's been a while. Greg, I need a favor. He hesitated. This about a case? Sarah swallowed. Yes. Lily Reynolds. Silence. Then a sigh. That's a name I haven't heard in a long time. I think I might have something that belonged to her. A pause. Meet me at the station. Sarah pulled on her jacket. Shadow stood the moment she did, ears perked, tail stiff. He wasn't going to let her leave without him. 15 minutes later, she walked into the police station, Shadow at her side. Greg met her in the lobby, his brows furrowed at the sight of the dog. That him? She nodded. His name's Shadow. Greg led her to a quiet office, closing the door behind them. Sarah placed a locket and bone on his desk. His expression darkened as he examined them. Where did you get these? She explained. How Shadow had appeared at her doorstep, how he had delivered the bundle, how someone had been watching her house afterward. Greg listened without interrupting, his face unreadable. When she finished, he leaned back. This is not what I expected to hear today. Greg, do you remember anything unusual about Lily's case? He hesitated. I was a rookie when she went missing, but yeah, something always felt off. He tapped the locket with his finger. Her family was devastated. Her parents never stopped searching, even when the town moved on. But there was no evidence. No footprints. No signs of struggle. Just gone. Sarah frowned. If she drowned, why wasn't her body found? That's the thing, Greg admitted. The creek wasn't deep enough to carry someone away. And yet, nothing ever turned up. Sarah glanced at Shadow. And now, 10 years later, her dog shows up with this. Greg sighed. This bone, if it's human, will need forensic testing. But if you're right, and someone doesn't want you looking into this, he shook his head. You should be careful, Sarah. She already knew that. Greg leaned forward. There was one other thing. A witness. An old fisherman claimed he saw something the night Lily disappeared. Said she was running. Sarah's pulse spiked. Running from what? Greg shook his head. He wouldn't say. Just kept muttering that she was scared. Sarah inhaled sharply. Where is he now? Greg's expression turned grim. Dead. Years ago. Car accident. A chill crawled up Sarah's spine. Too convenient. Greg pulled a folder from his desk drawer, flipping through faded reports. Lily's parents moved away after the case went cold. Couldn't stand staying in a town that had forgotten their daughter. He handed her a yellowed newspaper clipping. But the cabin's still there. Sarah studied the photo. A small, weathered structure, half hidden by trees. She looked at Shadow. Is this where you want to go? The dog stood immediately, tail rigid, muscles tense. Greg sighed. Sarah, are you sure about this? No, she admitted. But I have to find out. Greg hesitated, then handed her his spare flashlight. At least take this. She nodded, slipping it into her bag. If I find something, call me. Immediately. She left the station with Shadow trotting beside her, his eyes fixed ahead. He knew the way. The drive to Silver Creek took an hour, the road winding through dense forest. The further she went, the quieter the world became. No houses, no streetlights, just trees pressing close, their branches clawing at the sky. She parked at the base of a narrow trail, the entrance barely visible beneath tangled vines. The air smelled of damp leaves and earth. Shadow was already moving, paws light on the soft ground. Sarah followed. The deeper they went, the more unnatural the silence became. No birds, no insects, just the whisper of wind through the branches. Then Shadow stopped. His ears flicked forward, body rigid. Sarah followed his gaze and saw it, half buried in the roots of an old tree, a torn backpack. She knelt, fingers trembling as she pulled it free. The fabric was stiff with age, the zipper rusted. But when she pried it open, her breath caught. A diary. The pages were yellowed, the ink faded, but the last entry was still legible. He's coming for me. If I don't make it out, I hope Shadow does. Asterisk, asterisk. Sarah's stomach twisted. A twig snapped behind her. She froze. Shadow growled low, his body tense. She turned, heart hammering. A figure stood just beyond the trees, watching, and then just as quickly as it appeared, it melted into the shadows. Sarah's hands clenched around the diary. This wasn't over. Sarah's breath came in shallow bursts. The diary trembled in her hands, the weight of its final words pressing against her ribs. Shadow stood rigid beside her, his growl a steady vibration in the silent woods. Whoever had been watching was still out there. The trees swayed, branches creaking in the wind, but she heard nothing else. No retreating footsteps, no snapping twigs, just the hollow stillness of something waiting. She forced herself to move, shoving the diary into her bag. If someone was trying to scare her, they hadn't nearly succeeded. But nearly wasn't enough. "Come on, boy," she whispered, gripping Shadow's collar as she rose. He didn't move at first, his body a coiled spring of tension, but after a moment, he turned with her. Together, they followed the narrow trail back toward the car. Every instinct screamed at her to run, but she forced her pace to stay even, her back straight. Running would only make her a target. She reached the car and yanked the door open, Shadow leaping into the passenger's seat without hesitation. Slamming the door shut, she locked it and exhaled, pressing her forehead against the steering wheel. A new problem loomed before her. The diary. He's coming for me. Sarah didn't want to believe what the words implied. But 10 years ago, Lily Reynolds had been running from someone, and now, someone was making sure the truth stayed buried. She pulled out her phone and dialed Greg. "Tell me you didn't go alone," he answered immediately. "I found something." She swallowed. "A diary. It's Lily's." Silence. Then, "Get back here. Now." She didn't need to be told twice. The drive back to town was suffocating, the night pressing in from all sides. Every passing car, every flickering street lamp sent her heart pounding. She kept checking the rear-view mirror, half expecting to see headlights tailing her through the darkness. But the road behind her remained empty. When she reached the station, Greg was waiting outside, arms crossed. She barely had the car in park before he was opening the door. "Inside," he ordered. She followed him, Shadow at her heels. In his office, she placed the diary on the desk. Greg flipped through the pages, his frown deepening with every line. Then he stopped, staring at the last entry. "This means she didn't drown," Sarah said quietly. "She was running from someone." Greg rubbed his temples. "This changes everything." A knock at the door made them both jump. One of the younger officers poked his head in. Deputy Mayor Hayes is here to see you." Sarah stiffened. Greg's expression darkened. "Send him in," Greg said slowly. The door opened fully, and Randall Hayes stepped inside. He was an imposing man, broad shoulders, graying at the temples, with the easy confidence of someone used control. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Greg, Dr. Thompson." He glanced at Shadow. "And the dog." Sarah didn't respond. Shadow sat stiffly beside her, his gaze locked onto Hayes, ears pinned back. "I hear you've been looking into an old case," Hayes said, settling into a chair. "Lily Reynolds, was it?" Sarah and Greg exchanged a glance. Hayes smiled wider. I'd be careful if I were you. Some things are better left alone. Sarah's fingers curled into fists. Why? Hayes sighed. Because, Dr. Thompson, digging up the past can have unintended consequences. Greg straightened. Is that a threat? Hayes shrugged. A warning. Sarah's pulse pounded. Shadow let out a low, deep growl. Hayes stood, brushing non-existent dust from his jacket. I'd hate for anyone to get hurt. His gaze lingered on Sarah. Then, without another word, he turned and walked out. Greg exhaled sharply. That was not subtle. Sarah stared after him. Greg. Her voice was barely above a whisper. It's him. Greg rubbed his jaw. It fits. He's been in power for years. If Lily was running from someone, it could have been him. Sarah shuddered. And if he's willing to threaten us now, what was he willing to do back then? Greg pulled out his phone. I need to make some calls. Stay here. But Shadow had other ideas. The moment Greg stepped out, the dog whined and trotted toward the door, pawing at it. Sarah frowned. What is it? Shadow growled, turning in circles, restless. His tail was stiff, his ears twitching. He was agitated. She felt it, too, a prickling sensation at the base of her skull. Then, gunfire. A single, sharp crack from outside. Sarah's breath caught. Shadow barked, leaping at the door. She didn't think, just moved, bursting into the hallway. She saw officers scrambling. Greg was already halfway down the corridor, gun drawn. What happened? She demanded. Shots fired outside. Greg barked, pushing through the station's front doors. Sarah followed, then froze. Hayes was on the ground, a gun clutched in his hand. His body was still, eyes wide with shock, blood pooling beneath him. Another officer stood over him, weapon raised, breathing hard. He pulled a gun. The officer stammered. I told him to stop, buddy. Greg knelt, checking for a pulse. He exhaled. He's gone. Sarah staggered back. Shadow stood at her side, his head tilted, as if assessing the scene. It was over, and yet a deep unease remained. The truth about Lily had been buried for 10 years. Now it had cost another life. But Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that this had been too easy. Hayes had power, influence. If he had kept a secret for this long, why get careless now? Why confront them so directly? Unless someone else had wanted him silenced. Greg stood slowly. We'll need to go through his records, see what else he was hiding. Sarah nodded, her mind still racing. Shadow nudged her hand, his golden eyes searching hers. She exhaled. Come on, boy. The town would finally know the truth about Lily Reynolds. And whoever else had been watching from the shadows, whoever had been pulling the strings, would know she wasn't going to stop.